The cameras were rolling, the audience was cheering, and then 82-year-old George Patterson gripped the edge of the Family Feud podium with hands that had once held rifles in frozen Korean trenches, hands that trembled now not from age but from memories that had never truly left him. When Steve Harvey asked about things nobody knows about you, George's response, delivered in the weathered voice of a man who had carried secrets for over 70 years, made the entire studio fall silent as they realized they were in the presence of someone who had sacrificed everything for strangers and had never asked for recognition. "I still remember the names of every soldier I pulled out of that frozen hell," George had said, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. 23 men. I can tell you their hometowns, their mothers' names, what they said when they thought they were dying, and not one of them knows I'm still alive. George Patterson had been drafted into the Korean War at 19 years old, a farm boy from rural Nebraska who had never been more than 50 miles from home before he found himself on a transport ship bound for a conflict that would define the rest of his life. He had served as a medic with the 2nd Infantry Division during some of the war's most brutal battles, crawling through enemy fire to reach wounded soldiers, performing field surgery in conditions that would have broken most men, and somehow managing to save lives when death seemed inevitable. The journey to Korea had been his first time on a ship, his first time seeing the ocean, his first time being away from the farm where he had grown up as the youngest of 5 children. His parents had sent him off with a Bible, a photograph of the family farm, and instructions to come home safe and make us proud. George had carried both items through every battle, the Bible in his left breast pocket over his heart, the photograph tucked inside it like a prayer. The Korean War had been unlike anything George could have imagined. The brutal winters with temperatures dropping to 40 below zero, the mountainous terrain that turned every movement into an ordeal, the constant presence of death and the way it changed young men into something harder and more desperate than they had ever thought possible. George had learned to perform medical procedures under fire, to make life and death decisions in seconds, to comfort dying boys who called for their mothers in languages he didn't understand. What had set George apart wasn't his medical training, which had been minimal, but his refusal to leave anyone behind. While other medics followed protocol and waited for safe opportunities to retrieve the wounded, George had developed a reputation for going into situations that seemed impossible, crawling through enemy lines to reach soldiers who everyone else had written off as lost. His commanding officers had alternately praised his heroism and disciplined him for taking unnecessary risks, but George had operated according to a simple principle: if someone was still breathing, they deserved a chance to go home. The stories George carried were the kind that Hollywood tried to capture but could never quite convey: the reality of young men dying far from home, the weight of making life and death decisions in split seconds, the way war changed everyone. It touched in ways that civilian life could never understand. George had been awarded the Silver Star for his actions during the Battle of Heartbreak Ridge, where he had single-handedly rescued 6 wounded soldiers from an overrun medical station, carrying them one by one through enemy territory to safety. But the medal had been presented to him in a brief ceremony at a base camp, with no family present and no understanding of what those actions had cost him physically and emotionally. George had accepted the medal, thanked his commanding officer, and never spoken of it again. The medal was somewhere in a box in his closet, along with his other military decorations and the letters from some of the families whose sons he had saved. The letters had begun arriving in the months after the war ended, forwarded to George through military channels as families tried to thank the medic who had saved their boys. Some were formal expressions of gratitude, others were deeply personal accounts of how their sons had returned home and rebuilt their lives. George had read every letter multiple times, had memorized the details about weddings and children and careers that had been possible because he had refused to give up on wounded soldiers. But George had never responded to the letters, feeling that acknowledging his role would somehow diminish the courage of the men he had served alongside. He had seen too many heroes who never made it home, too many boys who had died despite his best efforts. The ones he had saved were lucky, but George understood that luck in war was arbitrary and cruel, and he didn't want to take credit for outcomes that had depended as much on chance as on skill. But George had never spoken about his service. Not to his wife of 58 years before she passed, not to his children, not to his grandchildren who had brought him to Family Feud today. The war had ended, he had come home, and he had buried his experiences so deeply that sometimes he almost convinced himself they had happened to someone else. Almost. The nightmares, the way he startled at unexpected sounds, the tremor in his hands that doctors attributed to age but George knew came from memories of artillery fire. These things reminded him daily that some experiences never truly end. His wife Margaret had known something about his war experience, had seen the way he woke up, sometimes calling out names she didn't recognize, had noticed how he avoided movies about war and couldn't tolerate fireworks or loud noises. But George had deflected her gentle questions with humor or silence, and eventually she had stopped asking, understanding that whatever he had experienced was too painful to share even with the person he loved most. The decision to keep his service history private had become more difficult as George aged and began to realize that his memories might die with him. He had watched other Korean War veterans pass away without their families ever fully understanding what they had experienced, and he had begun to worry that the stories of the men he had saved would be lost forever. But the habit of silence had become so ingrained that George couldn't figure out how to break it, even with people who loved him. The Patterson family had come to Family Feud as a multi-generational celebration. George's grandson Michael, 25, had applied for the show as a way to honor his grandfather and create positive memories during what everyone understood might be George's final years of good health. George had been reluctant to participate, uncomfortable with the attention and noise of television, but his family had convinced him that it would be fun, a chance to spend time together, and maybe win some money for his great-grandchildren's college funds. During the pre-show preparations, George had been quiet and observant, taking in the studio environment with the kind of careful attention that had once helped him navigate battlefields. The bright lights and constant activity had initially overwhelmed him, triggering memories of chaos and urgency that he thought he had successfully buried. But his grandson Michael had stayed close, providing the kind of steady presence that helped George stay grounded in the present rather than drifting back to 1951. The production team had been charmed by George's dignity and old-fashioned courtesy, the way he stood when women entered the room, his habit of addressing everyone as sir or ma'am regardless of their age. They had no idea they were working with someone who had seen more trauma and demonstrated more courage than most people could imagine, someone who had saved lives under conditions that defied human endurance. The game had been proceeding normally. The Patterson family was competing against the Rodriguez family from California, and both sides had been playing with enthusiasm and good humor. George's daughter Linda had provided solid answers about household management, his son-in-law had contributed knowledge about sports and current events, and grandson Michael had shown his expertise in technology and pop culture. George had been positioned at the end of the family podium, where he could participate when he felt comfortable, but wouldn't be pressured to perform beyond his comfort level. George had been enjoying the experience more than he had expected. Steve Harvey's warmth and humor had reminded him of the camaraderie he had once shared with fellow soldiers, the way men could find laughter even in the darkest circumstances. The family atmosphere of the show had touched something in George that had been dormant for years, a reminder of the connections and joy that made life worth living. But when it came time for the category Things Nobody Knows About You, and it was George's turn at the buzzer, the question had struck at the heart of secrets he had carried for 7 decades. Steve Harvey had approached the podium with his usual warm energy, but something about George's bearing, the straight posture despite his age, the steady gaze that had seen too much, had made Steve adjust his tone to something more respectful. "All right, Mr. Patterson," Steve had said, using the formal address that felt appropriate for a man of George's generation and dignity. "Things nobody knows about you. What comes to mind?" George had looked at Steve, then at his family, then back at Steve with eyes that held depths of experience that couldn't be measured in years alone. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of memories that had been locked away for longer than most people in the studio had been alive. "I still remember the names of every soldier I pulled out of that frozen hell," George had said, his words measured and precise. 23 men. I can tell you their hometowns, their mothers' names, what they said when they thought they were dying, and not one of them knows I'm still alive." The studio had fallen into complete silence. Not the typical quiet of a game show pause, but the profound silence that comes when people suddenly understand they're in the presence of someone who has experienced things beyond their comprehension. Steve had looked at George with an expression that mixed surprise with dawning respect. "Mr. Patterson," Steve had said gently, "are you talking about military service?" "Korea," George had replied simply. 1951 to 1953. I was a medic. My job was to keep boys alive long enough to get them home to their mothers." Steve had paused, clearly moved by the simple dignity of George's response. "And you saved 23 men?" Steve had asked. "Those are just the ones I could count," George had said. "There were others. Boys who died while I was working on them, boys who made it to the MASH unit but didn't make it home. But 23, I got them out of there breathing, talking, asking for their girls back home." George's hands had begun to tremble more noticeably as the memory surfaced, and his grandson Michael had moved closer to provide support. "The thing is," George had continued, his voice becoming quieter, "they were all so young, 18, 19, 20 years old. They had their whole lives ahead of them. They had people waiting for them. And when they were hurt, when they were scared, when they thought they were going to die so far from home, they would tell me things about their families, their dreams, their regrets." Steve had moved closer to George, recognizing that this elderly man was sharing something profound and sacred. "And you remember all of them?" Steve had asked. "Everyone," George had confirmed. Private Tommy Chen from San Francisco wanted to be a teacher. Corporal Billy Martinez from Texas had a baby girl he'd never seen. Sergeant Mike O'Brien from Boston was going to marry his high school sweetheart when he got home. I remember them all. The emotion in George's voice had affected everyone in the studio. This wasn't just a war story. It was a testament to the weight that some people carry, the memories that define them, the way some experiences never truly end. Steve had made a decision then that surprised everyone, including himself. He had stepped back from George and in front of the entire studio audience had brought his hand to his forehead in a crisp military salute. "Mr. Patterson," Steve had said, his voice carrying absolute respect, "on behalf of everyone in this studio and everyone watching at home, thank you for your service. Thank you for saving those boys. Thank you for carrying their memories all these years." George had looked at Steve with surprise, then slowly, shakily had returned the salute with the precision of someone who had never forgotten his training. The studio audience had erupted, not in typical game show applause, but in a standing ovation that seemed to go on forever. People were crying, cheering, honoring a man who had never asked for recognition but who deserved more gratitude than words could express. But Steve wasn't finished. He had turned to address the entire studio. "Ladies and gentlemen," Steve had announced, "Mr. George Patterson is what we call a hero. Not because he asked to be one, but because when other people needed help, he was there. When boys far from home were hurt and scared, he risked his own life to save theirs. That's not just service, that's love in action." Steve had begun removing his suit jacket, the same jacket he wore for every taping. "Mr. Patterson," Steve had said, "this jacket represents my respect, my gratitude, and my recognition that some people sacrifice more than the rest of us can imagine. It's an honor to give it to someone who earned it in ways I never could." As Steve had placed the jacket around George's shoulders, George had looked up at him with tears in his eyes. "Those boys," George had said quietly, "they were the real heroes. They were willing to die for people they'd never met, for a country that sent them to fight in a place they'd never heard of. I just tried to get them home. And because of you, 23 families got their sons back," Steve had replied. "Because of you, those men got to live the lives they were dreaming about when they were scared and hurt. That's not just heroic, that's miraculous." The game had resumed, but it had been transformed. Both families had played not for themselves but for George, celebrating every point as a victory for a man who had already won the most important battles of his life. George had answered one more question during the episode, and his response had become legendary among viewers. When Steve had asked about things that make you proud, George had looked at his family and said simply, "Knowing that the boys I saved got to come home and have families like mine." The episode had ended with George wearing Steve's jacket, surrounded by his grateful family, while the entire studio gave him an extended standing ovation that honored not just his service, but his humility, his sacrifice, and his lifelong commitment to carrying the memories of those he had served alongside. After the cameras stopped rolling, George had spent time with Steve and members of the production team, sharing more details about his service and the individual stories of the men he had saved. His grandson Michael had taken notes, finally learning details about his grandfather's war experience that the family had never heard. The episode aired on Veterans Day and became one of the most meaningful and widely shared Family Feud episodes in the show's history. Veterans organizations had used George's story to highlight the experiences of Korean War veterans, who had often been overlooked in favor of World War II and Vietnam narratives. George had kept Steve's jacket as a symbol of recognition that had been 70 years in the coming. More importantly, he had finally begun sharing his stories with his family, helping them understand not just what he had experienced, but why he had carried those memories in silence for so long. Steve Harvey had learned something profound about the hidden heroes who walk among us every day, people who have sacrificed more than we can imagine, but who carry their experiences with quiet dignity rather than seeking recognition or praise. The jacket that Steve had given George became a treasured family heirloom, But its real value was in representing the moment when a forgotten hero was finally honored. When decades of silence were broken, when a studio full of people learned that true heroism isn't about seeking glory, but about serving others when they need you most. George Patterson had saved 23 lives in Korea, but on that day at Family Feud, he had reminded an entire audience what courage, sacrifice, and humility look like when they're embodied by someone who never stopped caring about the young men whose lives he had saved so many years ago. Because that's what heroism looks like when it grows old with dignity. That's what service sounds like when it speaks from the heart rather than seeking recognition. And that's what happens when a forgotten warrior finally receives the honor he earned but never asked for, reminding us all that some debts can never be fully repaid, only acknowledged with the gratitude and respect they deserve.